They've fixed up that road down there, but that's a dead end. So where they come through Pelaw Main, and they just won't take it. There's going to be a lot of people killed on this road before Christmas, that's for sure.
This is Newsnight, welcome back. Tonight we're debating the referendum, the yes case and the no case, with some eminent guests. Gentlemen, let's turn to question 3. To alter the Constitution to recognise local government.
Well, I think it's important that one of the 3 spheres of government isn't recognised presently in our Constitution at all. Of course, the federal government's always had the power to make direct grants to local government. But it's surely important that the document that is the source of our legal rights and the source of our system of government should have disclosed in it one of the essential levels of that area of government.
But it doesn't actually do anything though, does it?
Well, beyond recognising it, no, it doesn't. Not immediately. Not immediately. But it's no secret that the Local Government and Shires Association is very strongly supportive of this initiative, even if it is only a token suggestion or a token improvement. At least it's a recognition for them. And very often, local government is the area of least politicisation of people's representatives.
But of course,
they're the little people.
The federal government is only going to be able to do more about local government by further amending that particular section of the Constitution, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't give it a springboard into local government.
No, and I'd be surprised if the federal government wanted to get into local government in a big way.
Well, lots of people think it does.
Well, the problem though is that for those who regard it as a states matter, then it doesn't belong in the federal Constitution, because even with this question, this proposal puts it in the federal Constitution and says by its words it remains a state matter because it's got to do the things in accordance with the laws of the states. What is being said is that it somehow provides some protection from dismissal and from forced amalgamation. Well, that's just not so in my view, and I'm an alderman. I've got some very grave concerns about this question because what it provides for is a system of local government, and system is not defined, nor is local government, and therefore it's quite conceivable that if the dismissal procedure is part of the system, then that will take place, and it doesn't give local government the guarantees and protections that it needs and wants.
Don't you think that the amendment to the Constitution may give some power of federal intervention where it's contended that the state government hasn't exercised its powers properly under its own legislation? Do you think that's possible?
I guess that's one of the problems. Only yesterday, the New South Wales Attorney General came out and released parts of the State Solicitor General's report or advice, which said that there was some grave concerns about this question, because what it does is potentially give the High Court more power about what goes on inside New South Wales than the state parliament. Now, there are many people in the community who would say that that's a matter of grave concern.
Mr. Keneally, what do you think?
I don't think it's a matter of grave concern. That I tend to look on the High Court as the ultimate arbiter in these matters, as in all matters. The Constitution begins with the words, "whereas the people." The Founding Fathers in the 1890s saw power as coming from us, the people, and we whacked it up between the states and the federal government and the judiciary and the executive, etc., and the legislature as a means of achieving our welfare and our orderly governance. Now, it is very important that all areas of government that affect we, the people, get recognition in the Commonwealth's premier document. The way it's important that we get our vote recognised, and certainly our right to a fair vote, and certainly certain basic rights of the kind that are in question 4.
Let's move to question 4, to alter the Constitution, to extend the right to trial by jury, to extend freedom of religion, and to ensure fair terms for persons whose property is acquired by any government. Of course, those opposing this particular move, and I refer to you in this case, Mr. Saunders, say that to put all those questions together in one question is not a very sensible way to ask people to change the Constitution. Why is that?
Well, there are 3 very different rights, and they're all being lumped together, so that if anybody has a concern, a real concern about any one of those 3, that person would be well advised to vote against the whole lot, because you only have one vote for 3 questions.
But how could you be concerned? They seem pretty innocent to me. One would expect the trial by jury as a right that one would expect. Freedom of religion is something that we would surely enshrine in our way of life today. And compensation implied by the 3rd point, surely very harmless and worthwhile pieces of amendment to the Constitution.
That is so on the face of it. And that is the problem caused by the way the government has framed all 4 questions, because who opposes freedom of religion? Who opposes trial by jury? But let's look at what is actually going into the Constitution, because I'm not sure, and in fact I think to the contrary, that it does some things to hurt the rights that we have already.
I disagree entirely, because the legislation talks about the original legislation talks about making laws in respect of so-and-so, but the amendment cuts out those words, which then makes it, puts an embargo on the restriction being imposed through any legislative method, not just making laws.
That's very right.
And that's
through
the way it should be.
administrative decisions
that's
as
the
well.
whole point of it.
But that's what I see as a concern, because there are many things which are done publicly in relation to the Christian basis of our society, which may very well be challenged, such as prayers in Parliament, such as state aid for schools, and people say that that's not going to happen.
Changed.
Well, the law is changed because those words change. And once the words change, then you can bet your bottom dollar that there are people in the community that are going to go to the High Court and seek that things be declared unconstitutional, and it opens up a Pandora's box of challenges in that field.
I think you're misjudging the High Court. I can't imagine a judge on the High Court making a decision about religious exercise at a state level if this question were passed without having read the explanatory memoranda and the second reading debate and all relative documents. This is an extension of the limitation on the Commonwealth to legislate, to impose or restrict religion. It's an extension of that to the states, and it's also an extension to the states in the matter of their making any administrative decisions about freedom of religion. And the same with trial by jury. These things have operated, these 3 freedoms have operated at a federal level quite satisfactory for 87 years, and it seems astounding that that people should strain. Well, I know you're not straining to make up a case. I know you're a sincere and honourable Australian, but it seems astounding that people should be able to, should find it within their capacity to be able to make up a case by which freedom of religion becomes restriction of religion, a right to trial by jury becomes tyrannous, and the third one, right to compensation. We all know that the states have power to seize people's property compulsorily and use it in undue ways.
there should have been a separate question about juries, for example, because there's a bit of a restriction on the flexibility that the New South Wales state government is looking at in regard to juries in complicated cases and so on.
It's easy to say should have at this stage, but people do have to confront this particular ballot paper this Saturday. Is there a tendency then in the Australian people, if they have any doubts, to maintain the status quo and vote no rather than yes?
Yes,
and is that a danger for this constitutional
And the great
change?
tragedy is that more than 50% of Australians were not taught about the Constitution at school, and this means that they have no conception of the way, through no fault of their own, they have no conception of the way that it impacts on every aspect of our lives, and I'm sure you'd all agree with that. And
I think
unfortunately, under Section 128, we have the responsibility to vote in these referenda, and we don't know what we're voting about, and that's a national tragedy.
I think as time goes on, we're going to be called upon to vote in referendums more often. In the last 15 years or 20 years since the late 60s, we've been voting in referendums every 5 or 8 or 10 years. And I think if the Constitutional Commission continues its work, continues putting forward recommendations, I'd say the Australian electorate every decade or so will be asked to consider amendments to the Constitution. As Bob Menzies said, Bob Menzies, who wasn't a constitutional reformer, said, this is not a straitjacket. This document isn't good for all time. It will need to be amended as circumstances change and our society develops, and surely that's common sense.
Exactly.
Gentlemen, thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you.
And we'll be back with more of Newsnight in just a moment.
Meet some of the people who suffer from ME. Sonia Lawson lives at Saratoga on the Central Coast. She can only walk with a shuffle for a few minutes a day. Most of the time she's confined to her bed or this sofa in the living room. Chronic fatigue syndrome is a complaint which has dogged Sonia's life for a long time, but in the past 6 years has got progressively worse.
I think that when it's like, I think, oh, you know, they just want to be sick, yet I don't know one person with this illness that wouldn't give everything to just to have their health back, to live a normal life again. Because most people with it that I've met have been very active people.
How would you describe your life now?
Pretty devastating. I can't really put it any other way than that, because I've lost the ability to do a lot of the things that I mean, when I got this, I was at a stage where my youngest was about to go to preschool, and I could be doing so much. I had my music that I wanted to go on with. I liked painting, I like sport, a lot of things that I would love to be doing now. So I can't do any of them. I mean, I can play the piano a little bit on occasions, and I enjoy that, but I'm just so restricted.
What other areas?
And also doing away with the half Senate elections and the rotation of senators. It's nothing but weakening the Senate, and what it does therefore is to make it harder, I guess, for the Senate to do its job as an effective House of Review. And my view is that the Senate needs to be strong to ensure that the political mood of the hour does not go unchecked.
Mr. Boyd, why a yes case in this question?
Well, I feel that the Australian electorate gets sick and tired of going to elections every 2 years when they know that the term available is 3 years. With an availability of 4 years, that doesn't mean that every government will run a 4-year term, but it probably means that about every 10 years the Australian people will be going to the polls about once less often, and that's going to save us all taxpayers about $50 million. That's got to be a good idea. If a government goes much earlier than the 4-year term, then I feel that the electorate will respond to that by voting them out of office, or certainly heavily penalising them for doing that when they have a 4-year term available to them.
I don't see anything wrong, though, as some of the opponents of this question seem to do, with the idea that you have a Senate that might reflect the composition in the lower house. Although I don't think that you will always get a Senate that reflects the lower house. I see nothing wrong with simultaneous elections, and I must say neither did the Liberal National Party coalition Attorney General some years ago under the Fraser government when this question went up before. And so I just see this cry of hamstringing the powers of the Senate is very, very spurious.
Mr Mitchell, how do you view that particular proposal?
Well, you keep hearing the argument about checks and balances in regard to the position of the Senate. And there seems to be regarded as something wrong that the Senate should be subjected to the electoral process at the same time as the House of Representatives. Personally, I can't see anything wrong with that. And furthermore, it seems to me that if the government is presenting itself to the people for whatever reason, there's no reason why it shouldn't be the whole government instead of just a small part of it, or at least half of it. Now, the composition of the Senate will be determined by the way in which the number of senators from each state is selected. It's quite a different process, of course, so that it will still remain much the same sort of body, and the fact that it comes up for election or re-election or what have you at the same time as the House of Reps doesn't seem to me to be a great problem.
Does that bring us to our next question about altering the Constitution to provide for fair and democratic parliamentary elections throughout Australia? Are those two questions tied together, do you think?
This is the one I feel strongest about as a citizen, and I think that first, in our number one document, there ought to be some mention of our right as citizens to a fair vote. Secondly, and there isn't at the moment, secondly, although elections are run on a fair basis on the federal level under the Commonwealth Electoral Act, on the state level, anything can happen and does happen. And in Queensland, you have had cases where rural electorates have had only 1/3 the number of people that city electorates have. There are about 8 of those. There are a great number where the imbalance is 2-1. That means that you can get a government that represents only part of the people. I think it's essential to democracy that we have governments that represent the majority of the people. The states have had 87 years to clean up their act and haven't done it. And now the cry of states' rights is raised as a banner under which people are to be denied their right to vote. There aren't states' rights, there are only people's rights.
Ashley, you wouldn't agree?
No, I don't, because this question is not just about states' rights. Because the fact is that this question does not do away with the gerrymander. Only last year in 1987, in the federal election, the Liberal National Party's combined vote was greater than the Labor Party's vote, and we got 26 or 24 seats fewer, because this doesn't affect anything about rigging boundaries, doesn't affect those sorts of things. It is still possible under this provision to have rigged boundaries. And on the one hand, therefore, it's about states' rights and about drastically changing the constitutional structure of Australia for the first time to tell states what they should do within their own boundaries. But it's more than that, because it doesn't do away with gerrymanders and doesn't overcome the problem which we saw in the 1987 federal election.
Well, the Queensland Liberal Party thinks it does do away with gerrymanders because that branch, who has had the most to lose from a gerrymander, has supported this referendum question. Senator Cathy Martin has said she's voting yes, because the people of Queensland have had the most disadvantageous system of electing representatives. There's also a problem in Western Australia with the upper house. There's also a problem in South Australia. We've had very fair elections in New South Wales by our state laws. Other states haven't had the benefit of that, and I think it should be Australia-wide.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because last New South Wales election, the reality is that the Liberal National Party required in excess of 52% of the vote to win government. In Queensland right now, the Labor Party would only require 51.3% of the vote to win. But the gerrymander in Queensland is against the Liberal Party. The issue isn't whether it's favouring one party or the other. The issue is whether, one, this proposal puts into place the one vote, one value system, and I say it doesn't. And secondly, if it does, whether indeed it's a matter for the Commonwealth Constitution or for the state parliaments.
It starts to put in place one vote, one value. We have no guarantee of fair elections in our Constitution at the moment. This is the first step to guaranteeing into the next century, which is going to be a dangerous one, the principle of democratic elections.
Gentlemen, we'll take a break there and be back with more of our referendum debate in just a moment.
Meet some of the people who suffer from ME. Sonia Lawson lives at Saratoga on the Central Coast. She can only walk with a shuffle for a few minutes a day. Most of the time she's confined to her bed or this sofa in the living room. Chronic fatigue syndrome is a complaint which has dogged Sonia's life for a long time, but in the past 6 years has got progressively worse.
It's like my muscles are lead. It's like when you get the fatigue, if you keep going, it's as though they don't feel like normal arms and legs. They just feel as though you've got these things attached to you that are like lead. And then the pain sets in, and my muscles go into spasm, and they actually twitch. You can see them twitching.
As a young woman in her 20s, Sonia lived an active life. Sport played an important part, from water skiing to her trophy-winning basketball team. And she enjoyed hamming it up on the beach like any other young woman her age. But since ME turned her life upside down, Sonia has contemplated suicide more than once.
But when I went to pieces that time, I really sort of felt, this is the end, I can't go on anymore like this. But I pulled out of it because I started to find out other people who had it too. And by knowing that you're not alone, that can be quite helpful to cope.
Then there's the case of Robert and Stuart Baines from Long Jetty on the Central Coast. Aged just 25 and 30 respectively, they've been forced to give up work because of ME and now live with their mother.
Well, I was a painter and decorator, and I used to do a lot of training in sports, and now I just can't do anything like that because I'm just too sick.
So you were very, very active, and now all of a sudden that stopped?
Yeah, for the last 6 months I've just been sitting around doing nothing.
Painkillers are an evil necessity. A tablet such as Panamax replaces some meals. And days are spent at home in front of the television because both know their immune systems have been affected and they feel susceptible to almost every virus and sickness in the community. Young men who should be in the prime of their life seem to be wasting away.
We're so fatigued, right? We feel so sick that it's just impossible to enjoy yourself. And to, you could just go out for a few hours, right, and come back. When you got back home, you may not have had anything to drink or anything, and you'd feel like you've got a heavy hangover. You feel pathetic, really fatigued. Muscle aches, pains, joints everywhere. Everywhere's just sore, tender and aching.
How do you explain to your family and friends what you've got? What do you say to them?
We just say that we're always sick. We can't do anything, and our friends come around and say, well, come on, let's go somewhere. And you're just unmotivated. You just can't. You don't feel like doing anything.
Do they understand?
No, they don't. I've got one. A few friends of mine that they go around telling everyone. It's all in your mind, and that you're virtually a hypochondriac. Because you look so well.
That's
and,
right,
so fit. How could you possibly be sick?
And Cheryl Bryant of Avoca Beach has lived with ME since it was first diagnosed in her 5 years ago. An energetic woman who was holding down 2 part-time jobs. Today, her body is racked in pain. Her husband Roy sold the plumbing business to take care of his wife.
Well, it means originally, when I first came down with an original virus in '83, I could not move for virtually 6 months. I was bedridden, and I had to be showered. I had to be carried to the bathroom. I couldn't move in bed. I couldn't roll over. I had total lethargy and fatigue. But the pain, I was lying on many, many hot water bottles to try and stop the pain, to stop the intensity of it.
The problem with ME, or Myalgic Encephalomyelitis, is that not much is known about it. It's thought to be triggered by a virus, such as glandular fever, but the patient never recovers, a debilitating condition which can last for years. Professor Dennis Wakefield is the head of immunology at Prince Henry Hospital.
Is there any hope for people that have ME as far as some sort of medical cure?
Well, at the moment there isn't, and there won't be a cure until we know more about the basic cause of the disease.
Does that mean that at this stage the medical profession is reasonably ignorant about what causes ME?
Oh yes, very much so. We don't know the mechanisms involved. We think that it's caused by or precipitated by viral infections or other types of bacterial infection, and then that it subsequently affects the immune system. But why people get fatigued and what causes this to continue and be profound and prolonged is unknown.
In the past it's been called the